Welcome to Geekstorians, where we read between the panels of pop culture history the weird, wonderful, and defiantly creative roots of geekdom. I'm Dave from Geektown, and today we're cracking open a story inked in colour and controversy. It's the tale of how comic books, once dismissed as kid stuff, suddenly demanded to be taken seriously. This is the decade comics grew up. It's 1986, and somewhere in suburban England, a teenager hides a comic book inside a GCSE history textbook. The teacher thinks he's slacking off, but he's actually studying the end of the world. The cover's strange. It's a bright yellow smiley face splattered with blood. Inside there are heroes, but none you'd ever really want to be. A violent vigilante, a god who's forgotten what it means to be human, and a woman fighting to exist in a man's world. The Cold War ticks in the background like a doomsday clock. This isn't really escapism, it's an autopsy of the superhero myth. And across the Atlantic, another story is hitting the shelf. One about an aged crusader dragged out of retirement to save a city that really doesn't want him anymore. He's not a symbol of hope, he's a warning. And in the same year, a black and white graphic novel quietly begins to win awards for retelling one of history's darkest chapters, using mice and cats. 3 very different books, one seismic year. In 12 months, the cheap pamphlets once blamed for juvenile delinquency became something else. Literature, controversy, art. Teachers started putting them in reading lists. Critics called them graphic novels, as if adding the word novel might make them seem respectable. Librarians argued about whether to shelve them next to Shakespeare or Spider-Man. And some parents still frowned. But something irreversible had happened. For the first time, comics weren't just stories about heroes. They were stories about us, about power, paranoia, politics, and the people who build myth. The bright optimism of the Silver Age of comics had curdled into something darker, more self-aware, more cynical, and maybe more truthful. And that shift didn't come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making, born from censorship, rebellion, and a few restless writers who refused to colour inside the lines. To understand how comic books finally grew up, we need to start at the moment they stopped being a playground and became a battlefield. Before comics could grow up, they had to survive adolescence, and those teenage years were not kind. After the Second World War, superheroes were exhausted. They'd punched Hitler, sold war bonds, they'd marched across newsstands as symbols of victory. But when peace arrived, readers drifted away. Soldiers came home, kids grew up, and suddenly a guy in tights really didn't seem quite so exciting. Publishers scrambled. Romance comics, horror comics, space adventures, even talking animals, anything that might help sell a few more copies. But the real blow came not from the readers, but from moral crusaders. In 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham published Seduction of the Innocent, a book claiming that comic books were corrupting the youth of America. He said Batman and Robin promoted homosexuality, Wonder Woman inspired deviant behaviour, and horror comics turned children into criminals. It sounds a bit ridiculous now, but parents panicked, television talk shows wrung their hands, churches organised comic bonfires, yes, actual bonfires, and the US Senate held hearings on juvenile delinquency. Publishers were terrified of government regulation, so they decided to police themselves. They created the Comics Code Authority, a set of rules so strict that it made Disney look edgy. No horror, no drugs, no excessive violence, no sympathy for criminals, and absolutely no questioning authority. Even words as simple as terror or weird were banned from the titles. It was the creative equivalent of putting the entire medium in a straitjacket. For the next 20 years, most mainstream comics lived inside that cage. Batman stopped being a creature of the night and started solving crime with colourful gadgets. Superman became a cosmic babysitter teaching moral lessons between the panels. Everything dangerous and subversive or adult was scrubbed out with soap and smiles. But repression always breeds rebellion, and by the late 1960s, the cracks were beginning to show. The counterculture was on the rise. Music was radical, film was pushing boundaries, and readers were ready for something weirder than talking dogs and space aliens. Marvel, under the legendary Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, tapped into that mood. The Fantastic Four argued like family. Spider-Man had anxiety. The X-Men were metaphors for prejudice. They didn't tear up the code, but they did bend it until it squeaked. And then came Green Lantern and Green Arrow, two middle-aged white superheroes suddenly confronted with racism, poverty, and drug addiction. One famous story, Green Arrow discovers his sidekick Speedy is a heroin addict. A plotline so shocking that the Comics Code Authority refused to approve it.
Denied.
DC published it anyway. The issue sold, it won awards, and for the first time forced the code to blink. Within a year, the rules were being rewritten to allow real-world problems like drug use and social commentary, but still under their tight control. For the first time, the censors had followed the storytellers instead of the other way around. Meanwhile, in the shadow of the mainstream, something else was bubbling up: the underground comics movement. These weren't printed by DC or Marvel. They were Xeroxed and sold under the counters at record shops and college campuses. Creators like Robert Crumb, Trina Robbins, and Spain Rodriguez threw the code in the bin and made comics about sex and politics and rebellion. They treated comics as self-expression, not mass entertainment. The establishment, of course, saw filth. The next generation, they saw freedom. So by the end of the 70s, two parallel streams of comics existed. One bright and clean, still ruled by the code, the other raw, anarchic, exploring counterculture and identity. It was only a matter of time before those two things collided, and when they did, in the 1980s, it didn't just change comics, it changed how we thought about storytelling itself. In the US, Frank Miller and Chris Claremont were already testing how far superheroes could bend before they broke, exploring trauma, identity, and consequence in ways the original code really couldn't have imagined. But it was Britain that turned that experiment into a revolution. It was a country on strike, fueled by punk, where a new generation of writers were sharpening their pens like switchblades. Britain in the late 70s could be called a comic in search of a writer. The lights kept going off, the bins weren't being collected, and every newspaper headline seemed to end in either a question mark or a riot. It was a country angry at the establishment, but that anger bred to imagination. Kids who'd grown up on things like Eagle and Dan Dare were now clutching pens instead of ray guns, channeling the chaos of their times onto the page. In 1977, the same year Star Wars hit cinemas, a scrappy new British comic launched, 2000 AD. It promised the future, but it was really about the present: fascism, corruption, and absurd authority dressed up in space helmets. Its flagship character, Judge Dredd, was both hero and warning. A lawman so extreme he made Dirty Harry look like a social worker. The writers of 2000 AD were young, broke, but brilliant. Names like Pat Mills, John Wagner, Alan Grant, and also a soft-spoken magician from Northampton called Alan Moore. They were working in cramped flats, sometimes paid less than plumbers' apprentices, but they were writing satire sharp enough to draw blood. Moore's early stories dripped with working-class anger and black humour. He saw comics not as pulp, but as literature with pictures. A place where big ideas could live alongside explosions. His future shock stories were bite-sized morality plays that often ended with humanity getting exactly what it deserved. You could feel the cynicism of Thatcher's Britain between every panel. Moore would soon take his radical sensibilities and pour them into a single defining work, one that turned the superhero myth inside out and made the world take notice. But before that, in 1982, tucked away on the pages of a small British anthology comic called Warrior, he began writing a story about a masked anarchist fighting a fascist government in a near-future Britain. It was called V for Vendetta. Where Judge Dredd mocked authoritarianism, V took it personally. He was angry, poetic, and unmistakably political. It was a howl from Thatcher's Britain. Moore's anti-hero wearing a Guy Fawkes mask wasn't a saviour but a symptom. The ghost of rebellion haunting a country that had traded freedom for order. It was art born of austerity, and its influence spread quietly but deeply. V for Vendetta didn't just push the boundaries of what comics could say, it proved that the medium itself was capable of revolution. And across the Atlantic, publishers began to take notice. Marvel UK had been reprinting American titles for years, but DC saw something different. A raw, unfiltered creativity the American system and its code had squeezed out. These Brits weren't afraid of politics or pessimism, they were raised on it. Karen Berger, an editor at DC, began recruiting them from across the pond. Part of that appeal was freedom. American editors were still negotiating with the long shadow of the Comics Code Authority, a set of rules born in the 1950s that really hadn't quite caught up with the world outside. Even after it softened in the 70s, the code still frowned on politics, horror, and moral ambiguity. The British writers that DC were now importing had never had to live under it, and their stories crackled with the kind of danger the code still pretended didn't exist. Moore was the first major export, hired to revive a minor swamp monster nobody really cared about at the time. The result was Saga of the Swamp Thing, a horror comic that became a philosophical treatise on identity, nature, and the soul. Readers were expecting a sort of monster mash and ended up getting an existential crisis instead.
I'm sorry, what?
Soon others followed. Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, Pete Milligan, Jamie Delano, each bringing their own blend of surrealism and punk sensibility. They weren't just writing American heroes, they were deconstructing them. Batman became a symbol of obsession, Superman a commentary on idealism. Even John Constantine, the chain-smoking exorcist from Hellblazer, felt like a bloke you might actually meet in a Soho pub. It wasn't colonization, it was a cultural exchange with fangs. The British writers injected irony, politics, and literary depth into the superhero comic, speaking to a generation who were raised on Doctor Who and Monty Python and Thatcher's Britain, blending gallows humour with genuine social critique. And DC, to their credit, gave them that freedom. They wanted something new, stories that could appeal to an older readership without losing the thrill of the medium. Out of that freedom came a new philosophy. The comic as a weapon, not a toy. An idea that would soon cross the ocean. 1986 wasn't just a good year for comics. It was the year the medium stared into the mirror and didn't quite like what it saw. Moore had already torn down the system once with V for Vendetta. Now, alongside artists like Dave Gibbons and Frank Miller, he was about to dismantle the superhero itself. Every era has its defining works, the touchstones that change everything and leave imitators in their wake. For comics, that moment came with Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and Mouse. Together, they did what decades of campaigning never could. They convinced critics, academics, and a few skeptical parents that comics could be serious art. And they didn't do it politely. Watchmen arrived first, 12 issues from DC, written by Alan Moore and drawn by Dave Gibbons, both alumni of Britain's punk-infused comic scene. It looked like a superhero story, but felt like a crime novel wrapped in a political philosophy. Every panel was precise and symmetrical and obsessive. Every hero broken, a fascist in a mask, a god who'd forgotten empathy, a man who thought the apocalypse might actually save humanity. It was a world where the Cold War never ended and the American dream had expired quietly in the corner. It wasn't just a story about heroes, it was a story about the idea of heroes and what happens when that idea curdles into control. Readers expecting escapism found themselves dissecting geopolitics and trauma diagrams. Critics compared it to Citizen Kane. Teenagers like me compared notes to see who'd noticed the hidden smiley faces. But Watchmen didn't ask for respect, it demanded an autopsy of the superhero. Meanwhile, in another corner of DC, Frank Miller was pulling Batman out of the camp shadows and into something brutal. The Dark Knight Returns reimagined Bruce Wayne as a middle-aged man fueled by rage and regret, punching back against a society that had moved on without him. This wasn't the gadget-collecting detective of the 60s. This was an addict, mainlining justice to fill a void. Miller's Gotham was all concrete, neon and moral rot, a Reagan-era nightmare rendered in panels that hit like headlines. It was violent, yes, but more than that, it was self-aware. It understood that Batman's crusade was both noble and pathological, and that audiences were complicit in it. We wanted him to keep punching. We just didn't want to think about what that meant. The Dark Knight Returns sold out repeatedly. Hollywood came calling. And in the process, the superhero stopped being a power fantasy and became a psychological case study. And then came Mouse. Art Spiegelman's black and white memoir didn't look like the other two. There were no capes, no muscles, and no gadgets. It was the story of his father, a Polish Jew who survived the Holocaust, told with the Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. The cartoon imagery was almost unbearable in its simplicity. It forced the reader to confront horror through the language of innocence. These three books, one deconstruction, one resurrection, and one confession, together they tore down the boundaries between pulp and literature, and comics would never look the same again. The irony was none of these books had the Comics Code seal. By the mid-1980s, DC had quietly stopped submitting their prestige titles for approval, not out of protest, but because the code no longer mattered. The watchdog of the 1950s wasn't built to police moral complexity, and by now it was mostly guarding the gate of an empty yard. But the influence of these books rippled outward fast. Miller followed The Dark Knight with The Killing Joke, drawn by Brian Bollard, pushing Batman into a psychological horror and moral ambiguity. Editors and filmmakers began to take notice that these stories could hold adult weight. In 1989, Warner Brothers released Tim Burton's Batman, a film directly inspired by that darker tone. Its gothic grandeur and pop art menace translated this new seriousness of comics onto the big screen. Burton himself wasn't a lifelong comics fan, but he understood the mood of the moment, and audiences were ready for it. The film was a phenomenon. Bat symbols on every t-shirt, cues around every cinema. Comics had gone from the margins to the marquee. But every revolution has an aftershock. And not everybody who followed understood what made those stories great. When any aftershock hits, the first thing that follows is the echo. The success of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns sent that echo rolling through the industry like thunder. Publishers looked at the acclaim, the awards, the sales, and drew the simplest possible conclusion. People didn't want heroes, they wanted trauma. The word dark became a sales pitch. Every vigilante grew a 5 o'clock shadow. Every city was rain-soaked and corrupt. The more blood you spilled, the more adult it was supposed to feel. In the rush to be profound, the industry had forgotten to have fun. Characters who once stood for hope were rewritten as brooding anti-heroes. And in all of this, how do you solve a problem like the Boy Scout that's Superman in a world this cynical? The answer? You kill him. Temporarily, of course. But in the meantime, you sell the funeral issues to anybody with a credit card. And while some of this introspection was brilliant, Frank Miller's Born Again, for example, much of it felt like performance art for cynics. At this point, even the code itself had begun to completely unravel. After years of protests, it was revised to allow adult themes like drug abuse. A tacit admission that Green Arrow's harrowing scandal back in 1971 had made honesty impossible to ban. By the early 90s, maturity had become a shorthand for misery. Comics were drowning in trench coats, monologues, and rooftop angst. But underneath that noise, something a little more interesting was happening. A new generation of artists and writers, frustrated with the corporate control, had decided to start again from scratch. At Marvel, their work had sold millions of copies, but the company owned every page, every character, and every penny of merchandise. The artists who turned Spider-Man and the X-Men into global icons couldn't claim a single right beyond the signature on the art. In 1992, 7 of Marvel's biggest stars, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silverelli, Eric Larson, Jim Valentino, and Wilche Portacio walked out and formed Image Comics. Their rallying cry was simple: creators should own their own work. It was punk rock with ink stains, loud, flashy, and defiantly independent. The books were outrageous. Spawn, Wildcats, Savage Dragon. Not subtle, but they belonged entirely to the people who made them. For the first time, artists were the rock stars of their own medium. The downside to all this was the money started moving faster than meaning. Speculators started buying comics like stocks, bagging and boarding them in the hopes that they'd one day put their kids through college. Publishers were churning out collector's editions by the truckload. Foil covers, holograms, polybags. It was capitalism in a cape. When the bubble burst in the mid-90s, hundreds of comic shops closed. The industry had mistaken novelty for growth and commerce for culture. While the mainstream was obsessing over grimaces and gun belts, a quieter revolution was taking shape. Writers like Neil Gaiman, Mike Mignola, Jeff Smith, and Terry Moore were creating stories that blended myth, fantasy, and folklore. Thoughtful, funny, and emotionally rich. Comics were rediscovering texture, horror that could be tender, fantasy that could be personal, superheroes that could feel human again. The loudest voices had shouted themselves hoarse, and out of that silence, new ones were emerging. Quieter, stranger, but far more enduring. The so-called Dark Age was over. Out of the ruins, the medium had rebuilt itself, wiser, stranger, and finally comfortable in its own skin. It was ready to step beyond the pages. By the end of the 1990s, comics had rebuilt themselves, wiser, stranger, and far more confident. What began as pulp storytelling had matured into a language the rest of the world was finally learning to speak. The page had healed, and now wanted out, and film was the first to listen. The darker tones of Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Killing Joke had already taught Hollywood that comics could handle weight. After Batman '98, the floodgates opened. In the 1990s, films like The Crow, Blade, Men in Black, and Mystery Men experimented with style and tone, proving that comic adaptation could be tragic, slick, and gleefully absurd. Comics had become the new myth reservoir, and every studio wanted to dip a bucket in. At the same time, the medium itself was being taken seriously in ways creators could barely have imagined. Bookshops gave comics their own shelves, libraries stopped hiding them behind children's sections. Sandman and Watchmen were appearing on university reading lists. And Art Spiegelman's Mouse won a Pulitzer. For the first time, critics talked about graphic literature without smirking. And then came the web. Suddenly anyone with a scanner and a story could publish to the world. Webcomics, message boards, and fan archives ignored the old gatekeepers entirely. The internet allowed creators to bypass the traditional industry and speak directly to the audience, leading to a new wave of creativity without the restrictions of print runs or editorial control. Comics were no longer bound by the physical pages or the market whims. They could grow, adapt, and experiment in real time. And through all this, the independence of the medium was never lost. Publishers like Dark Horse, Fantagraphics, and Drawn and Quarterly championed creators who treated comics as poetry, personal, intimate, and defiantly odd. Books like Hellboy, Ghost World, and Love and Robots showed that comics could hold both myth and mundanity without compromise, finding beauty in the most unexpected places. Comics didn't just evolve, they expanded into new forms, new formats, and new audiences, proving the medium's viability. They grew beyond the page, yet stayed rooted in the creative impulse that started it all. By the turn of the millennium, comics had done something extraordinary. They'd stopped apologizing for existing. What began as pulp entertainment had evolved into an art form that film, television, and gaming all wanted a piece of. The irony is that it took the outsiders, the fans, the obsessives, the weird kid with the sketchbook to redefine the mainstream. And the same people that once hid comics inside schoolbooks were now shaping television itself. And on TV, the influence was everywhere. Serialized arcs, anti-heroes, moral ambiguity, techniques that comics had refined became the backbone of modern storytelling. No capes required. Prestige drama embraced the same sort of long-form rhythm and character complexity that comics had been practicing for decades. And at the same time, direct adaptations showed the range the medium had always contained. DC's Arrowverse offered a brighter, character-forward playground that still took continuity seriously. And on Netflix you had darker street-level stuff with Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage and The Punisher, Bruised Knuckles, Trauma and Consequence. And then there's Netflix's critically acclaimed Heartstopper, a show that many viewers might not even realise began as a comic. A gentle, beautiful coming-of-age story born as Alice Osman's webcomic and graphic novel, transformed into a hit series about two boys falling in love. Proof that comics can be goofy, warm, inclusive, and whisper quiet as well as being gritty. And here's the tell of how far the medium's respect had travelled. Osman, the book's creator, was trusted to write every single episode of the series. The author's voice carried intact from the page to the screen. Not every adaptation is literal either. Damien Lindelof's Watchmen arrived as a remix/sequel, a conversation with the original text reframed for a different America. That's the other lesson that comics taught TV. Continuity isn't just lore, it's a living argument about what stories mean now. In the end, the legacy of the 1980s revolution isn't just darker heroes or shared universes. It's the discovery that comics can hold anything: philosophy, politics, heartbreak, hope, and that television could borrow their grammar to tell bigger, braver stories. Comics stopped asking to be taken seriously. They started teaching everybody else how to think in chapters. Today, their language runs through the shows we binge and the worlds we return to. Panels became episodes, issues became sequels, and the old weekly wait for a new issue found a new home in the mid-season break. The medium grew up, and television grew with it. Walk into a comic shop today and you won't just find superheroes, you'll find memoirs, romance, horror, slices of life, politics, philosophy and poetry, all told in panels. The medium that once fought for legitimacy now barely notices the argument. It just gets on with telling stories. Webtoons and digital platforms have turned comics into a global conversation. Creators from Seoul to Sao Paulo publish straight to phones, their panels built for scrolling rather than turning. And at the same time, printers become the medium's luxury form. Oversized editions, hand-stitched anthologies, Kickstarter exclusives, proof that the ink still matters. The industry isn't perfect. Big publishers chase synergy with films and games, sometimes at the expense of strange personal stuff that keeps comics alive. But those personal stories keep slipping through, from small press zines to Eisner winners that look nothing like what came before. Representation has changed too. Where once entire genres were gatekept, now you'll find LGBTQ love stories, trans heroes, neurodivergent protagonists, and creators from every background. The voices that built fandom from the margins now run the show, and everywhere in all that noise, a relic quietly disappeared. By the 2000s, the Comics Code Authority was little more than a logo nobody noticed. Marvel had stopped submitting books in 2001. DC, which had been sidestepping the code for its prestige titles since the 80s, finally dropped it completely on January the 20th, 2011. And when the last holdout, the eternally wholesome Archie Comics, bowed out a day after that, the code was officially dead. If you've even lost Archie, you know it's over. The rules that once kept comics in check had vanished, and the medium used that freedom to become something richer and stranger and more human than ever. And somewhere between the spandex and the self-portrait, the heart of comics still beats the same way it did a century ago. Person, a blank page, and a question. What if? Comics grew up, but they never grew old. They just keep reinventing what story can look like. When comics grew up, so did we. The medium that once taught us to dream in bright panels started teaching us to question the world inside them, to see heroes not as answers, but as mirrors. And in doing that, comics became something far bigger than a subculture. They became a workshop where modern storytelling learnt its craft. From Watchmen to The Dark Knight Returns, from Mouse to Heartstopper, comics showed us that stories could be about more than just heroes and villains. They could be about society, about morality, about us. And as comics grew, they invited us into new worlds, to explore new ideas, and to see the ones we thought we knew in a new light. Today, comics are not just part of the entertainment landscape. They are the landscape. They fill our movie screens, our TV shows, our video games, our bookshelves. What began as pulp fiction is now a dominant force in pop culture, shaping everything from blockbuster films to prestige television, from independent novels to viral digital art. Comics have become more than just a medium. They are the lens through which we see the world, from the fantastical to the everyday. They've proven that stories can be everything, heartbreaking, thrilling, hopeful, and dark. And perhaps most importantly, they've shown us that storytelling doesn't have to be confined to the page. It can grow, it can expand, it can change shape over time. So what's next for comics? They'll keep evolving, of course. They'll keep speaking to us in ways that we haven't even imagined yet. But one thing's for sure, comics won't stop dreaming. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. If you want to keep up with the latest TV, film and gaming news, or dive deeper into the stories behind geek culture, you'll find it all at geektown.co.uk and on our sister show Geektown Radio, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and join me next time as we turn the page on another chapter of the history of geek culture.